Welcome. My name is Peter Wanders. I'm the president and CEO of Anderson Ranch, and I'm super excited to have you all here. These lectures are made possible by a lot of philanthropic support. So those of you who are in the National Council or Board of Trustees, thank you for being here and what you do. We have some underwriters for this program. That includes Toby Devin Lewis, who many of you know built a lot of artistic careers through her work at the Progressive Collection, and we're really honored to have her name associated with this series. Ulight Arts, nonprofit art center out of Miami, is a big supporter of the ranch. They bring residents here, again, really investing in and building young artistic careers. Again, it's such a great fit for what we do here at the ranch. And finally, Coldwell Banker is our summer series sponsor and help us with our National Council event. So really thankful to those of you from Coldwell Banker who are here as well. The real show today, Derrick Adams, you guys want to come join us on stage? Derrick, we're thrilled to have you here. Helen is our curator in residence, helps put together our programming, helps make sure we take care of artists the way we should, and really helps curate and create experiences here at the ranch throughout the year. So Helen, thank you so much. I'm going to pass over and let you introduce Derrick. And thank you for leading your conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Such a beautiful crowd on such a beautiful summer day. So I wonder if, Kevin, if you wouldn't mind hitting play on the PowerPoint, that'd be great. And it's my real pleasure to have Derrick Adams here with us today. I think I've been following your work actively. I saw a show of yours at the California African American Museum in Los Angeles.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe 2013, 14, something like that.
I think it was 16, right?
Was it 16?
I think it's 16,
Wow,
yeah.
look at you. You got
Time
a good,
flew, yeah.
you got a good brain. And I've been following the work and watching it develop over the years, and I've just been so excited about what you're doing. So I'm glad to have you here at the ranch. So as everybody knows, I'm going to ask Derrick a few questions. I haven't told him what the questions are. So it's like a pop quiz, but he's the expert, so everybody can relax because he knows all the answers to the questions. And then after a couple of questions and a little conversation, we'll open it up for audience questions as well. And I just ask that when we do the audience questions, wait until you get a microphone, because we are live streaming this on the interweb, and then it gets put up on our YouTube channel. So if we can't hear your questions on the internet unless you speak into the microphone. Okay. All right. Hi.
Hey.
How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Okay, good. All right, good. In reading about you and your work, one of the things you have talked about is seeing work of Jacob Lawrence as a young person and identifying that as something like, I want to do that. And to me, I just had this like light bulb. I was like, oh, Jacob Lawrence, that's incredible, because one of the things I always think when I'm in the presence of your work is you ride the knife's edge between color and shape. Mm-hmm. And so does Lawrence. And I guess I want to know a couple of things. One, once you saw that work as a child, then what happened? Two, do you still look at Lawrence when you're thinking about your work? And three, how do you negotiate color and shape? Because you do both so beautifully, and yet sometimes in art history, those two things have been held apart from one another.
That's a good question. I actually had the opportunity to first see Jacob Lawrence's work in a book at the Public Library in Baltimore, where I was probably a freshman at the college there, and I had to do a book report. And I happened to, rummage through the books at the library, and I saw this book, which was a very, probably a first edition of a Jacob Lawrence book. And I was just blown away by just the simplification of the shape and form, but the way that he was able to capture meaning and depth in a way that I, as an artist, young artist, was still trying to figure out. So I wasn't really making shows or anything. I'm making work. I was in school, but I was just really fascinated by the work because I had never been exposed to his work. But then I flipped to the back of the book, and it was a photograph of Jacob in his early 20s, and I think he had a pipe and like a suit jacket on, a sports
Right.
jacket. And I said, "Wow, that's cool." I want to go. In the bio, it said he taught at Pratt, and I had never heard of Pratt. But I found out it was still existing, and I basically went back to school and said, "I'm going to Pratt. I'm leaving here," and I went to New York, and I actually had the privilege of meeting Jacob.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he came. They honored him at Pratt, and I guess I gained a reputation for asking people about him at the school. Some of the professors, and some of them actually were his students. And so when he was honored, they asked me to be the usher for he and his wife, Gwendolyn.
Gwendolyn,
And
yeah.
so I basically walked them around campus the entire day and hung out with them. And I didn't talk much because I was just so blown away that I came all the way to New York and met this artist who moved out of New York to Seattle and came back. But I've always been really interested in his work and interested in the idea of, this conflict that, a lot of artists of color have with negotiating formalism with narrative.
Right.
And I was really interested in that as an artist because I always thought about form more and trying to impose narrative on form has always been very complicated because I always feel like the content is embedded in the form when you come from a perspective that is dealing with colonialism, oppression, those types of things, and dealing with the perseverance of that, I felt is really more missing in art than the idea of capturing and repeating those fractured narratives within the work. And what I liked about Jacob, and there was conflict with his practice over the time, is that he started off as this kind of very innovative young artist with a lot of exposure. And as he became really popular and being commissioned to do posters for the Olympics and things like that, he actually became criticized by his peers because abstraction was becoming very popular within the group of artists that he was his peers, and other forms of art making. So he was criticized for making things that were happy and making things that were so-called positive. But I feel like his experience was kind of the motivation for his work because he started off as an artist in his early 20s being collected in a major way. So his experience was very different from a lot of his peers. He went to Black Mountain, these things, artists, people wanted him around. And so he had a different perspective about himself as a Black artist at a particular time. So I think his work was genuinely representative of his real experience. And I always thought about that with work and how it's important for artists like myself to really expand on experiences to represent the duality of humanity in the Black experience with making work that can sit comfortably or even with conflict against other artists who are making things that may be opposite of what I'm making, to kind of give a broader perspective of what it is to be an American, to be Black, to be in this space where you're dealing with this idea of imposed narrative, imposed ideologies about what I'm supposed to be making.
Right.
Yeah, so Jacob Lawrence was like a perfect model for me as an artist because he broke so many boundaries at a very young age. And so to me, it proved the possibilities of success as an artist, even in the face of adversity. So I kind of like use that as a basic foundation for my career as an artist.
And this is a great image to sort of drill down on a little bit, like some of the things you were talking about: form, abstraction versus representation, color, shape. I'm curious the way in which these figures read. We read them as Black figures, and yet if you try and point to like what exactly
Yeah.
is Black about this figure, I'm like, oh, wait a minute, what am I bringing to this equation? And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you build up your figures through these blocks of color and these shapes?
Well, as an artist, I'm really also interested in artists like, Saul LeWitt and, artists who deal with hard abstraction as also a motivation to my work. And I always think of my presentation of my work is kind of being a connection to artists who kind of deal with hard abstraction. So when I'm creating the figures, I feel the essence of who they are is something that is not compromised within the experimentation of the tonality of the complexions and things like that. I think that they kind of represent a certain feeling of cultural representation that is not necessarily pigeonholed by what people think about tonality, because I think that tonality, even within Black culture, is also very complicated. And so, when I think about reflections on skin tones, I look at the very abstract way that we are composite or composed as figures, where we are made up of various shapes and tones, and light hits certain parts of our face and our bodies, and also looking at a lot of abstract African forms that I also really enjoy, but I also like to have this really important conversation about the progression of looking at traditional African forms as an American and looking at it in a way that it relates to popular culture and entertainment and things that, for me as a person, I'm drawn to visual language in a very particular way because of my personage and my cultural perspective.
Right.
So I try to bring that into the work, and I'd like to see a lot of, shapes and forms that kind of make the figure and the foreground and things that are kind of composing to make this image somehow deal with flatness and space and shape. So I'm always thinking about all those different things when I'm making an image.
One of the things that really runs through the work is a lot of pattern. And I think in some of the early work, you're actually using fabric. You're certainly making allusions to fabric, both Western fabric, African fabrics. Yeah. I'm curious, where does that impulse come from to connect to things that are really decorative, like fabric design?
Well, for me, I just became really interested in the way that the African pattern is somehow attached to politics, in that a geometric form that's coming from a particular region could not live as a form itself, and how in Western culture, images that deal with very similar structures of tone and shape can kind of reside as just a decorative pattern, right, or something that is just about the form. So I think that for me, I started using these different fabrics because I think as an American, as a Black American, they represent Black America. Because when you look at certain patterns, African forms and patterns in geometry, which is somehow has been kind of inserted in pop culture and also inserted into pop patterns, things like that, is not necessarily something you can trace point by point, similar to the history of Black America here. You can't really trace every step of the past, but you can kind of look at associations with pattern and color to give a better understanding of cultural legacy, cultural influence. And so for me, I feel like the way I'm making work, I feel like it's really more important for me to show instead of tell. And so I try to think of things that I can put in a place to kind of add a rich and dense conversation that the viewer can have with themselves and have with amongst themselves by looking at the work, and that I don't have to be the person to come in to explain why this is sitting next to this, but right, for you as a viewer to look at these things and contemplate on my intention. And so I really like certain, most of the patterns I've used that are African patterns are not necessarily made in Africa, but they're influenced by the history of pattern making in Africa. So I'm thinking about all these different things with consumerism, consumer culture, all those things are very important to my work.
Right. I want to use the opportunity of this slide because these pictures just drive me crazy. I love this body of work. And it seems like a bit of a departure from the more hard-edged African fabric, Jacob Lawrence kind of modality that you've been working in. They're so tender. And I wonder, why did you, like, where did the shift come? What's the difference for you between this kind of work, which is recent, and that last image that we saw, which is also relatively recent?
I like to make various bodies of work simultaneously, and I may have made that work next to the other work.
Oh, really? So you
Yeah.
were working on those kinds of intimate, like familial,
Yeah.
interior pictures at the same time you're working on these icon
Yeah.
heads. That kind of blows my mind.
Yeah,
They
I
feel
like-
like different parts of your brain.
Yeah, I like the idea of like having various like attitudes or various modes of emotion happening in the space, and the language of mark making is so essential to my deliberate interests as an artist. And so the paintings, the portraits were from my family's photo album, and they started from watercolors. And so I wanted to really capture the history of like portrait painting, oil painting in a certain way that I could not necessarily do with a hard edge painting. So I was really thinking even also with the framing of these paintings. They were oil paintings on burlap with like a dark walnut frame that I had custom made for these works.
But so you have a family photo, then you're making a watercolor, and
Yeah.
then those final images are
Yeah.
oil paintings made to look like watercolor.
Yes. So the way I did that.
How are, just for the painters in
No,
the
no,
room,
no,
because
no,
I know
no.
all the painters in the room are like,
No.
what is happening? Can you talk a little bit about how you're getting the effect of watercolor in oil?
Well, it was complicated, but it had many processes. I started off making these watercolors because I had not intended for them necessarily to be paintings or not. I was just kind of working. I'm always working on like experimenting in the studio all the time and thinking about like how to push things, when it's enough, when it's not enough. So I'm always very much taking one step at a time. And I think my best work is really when I'm not thinking about having a show, because I knew that I was making these paintings, and I would always say like, this is going to be a show, but I don't know where it's going to be. Like, this is going to be a show. And so I was making these watercolors when I did a residency, a short residency, and I decided to make these watercolors. And then I had the opportunity to work with a printmaker who created this kind of Frankenstein machine, CNC painting machine. And so he was like, I want you to test out this new machine I have. It's like a painting machine. It can actually duplicate your watercolors. So we tried. But the thing is about the machine, he said that it can't really make an exact crisp line. It basically just sprays, and so a lot of the work that could happen usually is abstract. So if you're willing to try it out, do that. So we did it, and so the paintings came out from the CNC machine, but that still wasn't the ending product. So I brought them back to the studio, and then I painted on top of those paintings.
Oh, wow.
So I painted on top of the painting after it came back from the printer, because I wanted to capture some of the watercolor in a certain type of looseness that was what I was able to capture with works on paper. But I wanted to bring back some of the kind of hard edge and some of the more exact shapes that you can see in the painting over top of the loose painting. So I kind of was using all this. So the whole series started really as this experiment. Like I wanted to make these paintings. I really wanted to make a show that represented the emotion and sensitivity I felt looking at the work. And so every time I make work, most of my work is not inspired by other works from the same medium. A lot of times I'll look at a Gordon Parks photograph and I'll think about how can I capture that in a sculpture. Because there might be a certain level of tenderness in a Gordon Parks photo that I really like, but I'm not trying to make a Gordon Parks photo. But what I'm trying to communicate is a feeling I felt looking at a Gordon Parks photo in my sculpture or in my painting.
Right.
So that was the motive of that work. I wanted to capture, everyone has photo albums of their family, and they all are special to them in some way. But being able to translate that into an artwork that's separate from that, and people still feel the tenderness in it, was my focus. And so that was the motivation behind doing the family photos. So every time when I started making the work, and then when I was asked to, use this new technique, I didn't know exactly how it was going to come out, but I was really open to get at what I wanted to convey. And so when he did the machine, it wasn't exactly there yet. And so I brought it back to the studio, and I kept painting on it until it got to the place that I wanted it to be.
They're so successful. I knew the minute I saw them, I thought, that's a late 70s, early 80s, drugstore pickup photograph. You know,
Yeah,
you could
yeah.
you could feel almost that quality of the palette, and then the way they were in the watercolor was so redolent to me of memory and nostalgia, and the way in which, that experience where you have a photograph of yourself as a child. You don't really remember that moment, but that picture becomes part of who you think you are in your memory.
Yeah.
And all that liquidity was just so great. So I'm really, I'm turned on by the fact that you were able to take that emotional feeling through all those steps. And it doesn't get lost. Maybe it even gets amplified, which
That's
is
what I
very
wanted to do. I wanted to
interesting.
amplify it, and the highlight of, for me, when I make work, even with, when I have a show with my gallery, Salon or Rona, is I think about what I want to say in that space, and I think about what work makes sense in that space at a particular time. And when I did the family portraits, the best thing about it is that I knew I wanted to be in a space that was not a conventional space. So I'm from Baltimore, and I was randomly invited to exhibit my work in the City Hall gallery in Baltimore. And so I decided to put those paintings in City Hall, in the public gallery at City Hall. And, and these paintings were very precious to me, but I thought that it should be in a municipal building and that people should be able to come see them through when they're having lunch and different things like that. But the funny thing about the painting is that I didn't think of it as a finished. I didn't think of the series was necessarily finished. But when I decided to show the 10 paintings, I didn't. I have a big family. I didn't paint everyone in the show. There's some people in the painting that I painted multiple times.
Did you get in trouble?
Yes, I did. I got in trouble.
It's good to know that even an artist such as yourself can still get in trouble on the family front. All right.
Yeah. So one aunt was in the painting numerous times, and I have a lot of aunts, and they were just like, "Okay, when are you gonna paint me?" But that was cool. I like that.
I really also love, especially after the year we've had where public architecture, public monuments have come under so much pressure, that you would put something so intimate and human in civic space, in public space like that. I think that there's a certain kind of bravery in that gesture. Did you feel any of that? Did you feel exposed? Were you thinking about the publicness of what it meant to do that, to have your work in that way?
Well, some people were. I usually do shows in municipal spaces. I did a show with City Museum in Harlem and the County Cullen Library, which was the last home of Madam C.J. Walker. I do a lot of thinking about representation and placement. So I was really focused on having it in a space that was not necessarily a gallery or a museum space for the initial presentation. After the initial presentation, I'm really open to other translations of where the work could be. But in my mind, I would think of it as almost being like a thesis. And so where it's being placed is as important as the work itself. But yeah, I always hear my friends say, some of my friends was like, "That is so nice of you to put your work in there." Or that is, or "Why are you putting your work in there?" Like that. But I always think that, for me, it's about putting the work in the space, documenting it in the space, and then for me, I move on. I feel like the place where it's documented is a historical record of where it's being presented, and after that, I'm okay with the work being separated or being put in another place. I just feel like the history will always go back to this place where it was first presented.
So in getting ready to talk to you today, I think of the 100 articles I read, 98 of them use the phrase black joy. So
Yeah.
I wanted to just and I get it, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
joyful, and
yeah.
it's black, and it's black joy,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
who doesn't like it? But by the 80th time I read the phrase,
yeah,
I
you were
was
like,
like, oh, come on now.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess I
Yeah.
want to ask you, what do you think first off, I want to ask you, what is the difference between joy and happiness, pleasure, contentment? Like, what does joy mean to you? And then could we talk about this new catchphrase, black joy, that's sort of running through art criticism at the moment?
Yeah, it's a lot. Well, I think it kind of came into like a common description of my work is because some of the response of the way that I make work, even from grad school time, has been difficult for people to place my work. Like the conversation around my work, the language is the way I talk about my work, and because of that reason, it was also opposed to trauma.
Right.
So for me, it was really funny because I always would think when people would say, that my work was, positive or, those words, I thought it was ironic because of, a black figure, sitting or laughing or whatever seems positive, but there's many paintings of like Dave Hockney and other artists who are making figures of sitting, Alice Katz and other artists I really like. They're not talked about in that manner. They're talked about based on the compositional structure of their work, the color palette of their work, things that I also am interested in as an artist.
Right.
But I think that the initial shock of the consistency of the narrative around my work has somehow challenged people to think about it in this idea of joy. Yes, I get joy out of making the work, but I think what I'm really interested in promoting this idea of normalcy in a way that brings joy into it, and the idea relating to blackness and joy is something that I think is really critical and important because when you think about the subjugation and the oppression and the colonial structure that people exist in, most people think that certain people don't have the time for joy or have the time to think about contemplation or family or happiness, but that's the norm for me and people like me. Like trauma is something that we understand is around us because of forces that are beyond us. But in my studio, I'm in charge in my studio, and I have the power to create and structure any narrative I would like. So I'm not going to bring something that's going to not empower me into my studio. I'm not going to bring something to my studio that's not going to make me feel like I'm in charge. So by doing what I do, it's not that I don't understand what's happening around the world, but I also understand that there's many things within my culture that are happening around the world that people are not giving the same level of exposure and representation in museum spaces because the idea for me, and I think that the reason Black Joy came into it is because a lot of structures, curatorial structures, I don't necessarily fit. I don't nestle in really smoothly next to some of my peers in museum exhibitions because my work is kind of the opposite of what they're doing. And I think that Black artists fit into this kind of space in the museum structure where we're the reality check of like what's happening in the world, but we don't have the freedom to actually explore other narratives that are very common to us, but not common to other people. And I think that motivated me to make the work that I make. And I think Black Joy just became a thing that I'd rather have that than Black trauma. So I'd rather have 100 articles saying that than saying something else. So maybe it'll expand more at some point, but I'm okay with that right now.
I'm wondering, do you think about listening to you talk and thinking about, it's true, I've never once, when looking at an Alex Katz or a David Hockney, said, now there is a picture of white joy. Which would be a crazy thing to do. I might actually have to write that article at some point. But one of the things that thinking that makes me think about your work is to think about your work in relationship to Matisse. Because Matisse uses a highly flattened picture plane, an extremely exuberant color palette, plays with flatness, and of course had the oppositional stance to Picasso. He's like lux calm et volupté, like, luxury, rest, and voluptuousness.
Mhm.
And that is like, that could totally be a title for one of your shows.
No, totally. No, I agree. Yeah.
And so I'm curious if, we tend to think more about Picasso these days, and you have an angular, planar compositional structure, but do you think about Matisse?
I mean, you can't not think about artists who are important like that. And I think for me, when I started to really discover Matisse and discover artists who dealt with collage and dealt with flatness and space, in my graduate level art making, I also did performance. And so the way I got into collage making or making these images is because as a performance artist, I thought I considered myself as a multidisciplinary artist, including performance. I thought collage making was very performative. And when I
Why?
was
Can you
yeah,
wait? Hold on.
yeah.
Why?
Because when I would see images of Matisse or different people, artists in their studio making these works, as an action of them doing it, I felt like this was like an extension of like a performative act of kind of constructing, I guess, ideas of reality or ideas of space through these very flat planes. And to me, I felt it was so much of interest to me transitioning from just making performance and sculpture to doing something that was very physical. And although painting is physical, but like cutting things and like moving things around and those types of things and sourcing images and looking at things felt so physical that I looked at Matisse, and actually the image of Matisse where I think his later years where he's in a bed and he has like a stick. Yeah. Like I love that image. And so to me, I think about performance and artists who make collage as kind of having some relationship to performance art in a way that the object becomes, a work, but the action of making it to me is even more interesting because they start from very little, and I don't think they even know, or I don't even know sometimes when I'm making towards the end. I'm just starting off with images and objects and material that I like, and I'm seeing if I can make something out of it.
I was actually going to ask you about what the difference is for you, if you can articulate it, between being in the process of making your work and then looking at your work, because we're seeing all this work displayed, so it's already made, and we arrive, and it's like all for us. But you've had this other experience where you've made it, and I wonder what the difference is between those two experiences is for you.
I mean, I'm always more focused on not knowing what I'm going to end up with. That's like one of my famous things that I always say. Like, I don't want to know. Like, I don't want to know. Like, I mean, I have certain things that are framed. Like, I know I'm working on a portrait of. I know I'm working like these images of these mannequin heads. They were shot first with a camera and then printed on a canvas, and then I painted on top of the image. And the reason I did that is because I wanted every image to be the same. I didn't want any influence from my hand as an artist to interfere in the object that's the foundation of the painting. And I wanted to spend time kind of really just dealing with the image and trying to kind of manipulating the image, similar to thinking about Andy Warhol portraits or Marilyn Monroe and those things where every time it went over the screen, it changed more and more. I was thinking about these figures as the same way. Like this is the one object. This is coming from one mannequin head, and this is actually what you see when you walk past the storefront. Is not that the image under the wig or the other material is different, but the transformation of this object that is so familiar to us has become something so different.
Right.
So
when you make those silk screens or printing the mannequin head onto the canvas, are there any other preparatory drawings, or when you confront your canvas in your studio, do you kind of know where you're going to go, or is that a moment of improvisation that happens and you don't know where you're going to end up?
Sometimes I might know, some works, like certain things, because I have probably over 100 images of storefront windows that I take when I'm traveling, of storefront window wig stores. But sometimes when I'm working on the paintings and when I'm just, in my studio, because I really love the idea of just being more interpretive and loose, I might look at I might say, let me look at what Rihanna got on today, or let me look at like a Beyonce look, and I kind of use that as a reference to kind of work on some of the mannequin heads. But a lot of the images that I use are mostly from photographic images that I've taken on my travels from, in the States, out of the States, of windows that I just like and images that I like. And then in the future, I don't do it as, like I know exactly when I'm going to use it, but I create my own database of reference material to use. So a lot of the looks come from actual photographic images.
Right.
Mhm.
All right, I've got two more questions for you. One is playgrounds. I know that you've made a playground. You're going to make another playground.
Yeah.
I'm really curious what the impulse is. Here you are making very adult, grown-up work, and yet you've got this side, like a side hustle in the playground
Yeah.
business. What's going on with that? Talk to me about why that's important to you.
Well, I've always had a desire to make playgrounds, even in undergrad. And my undergrad degree is in art education. So with my education at Pratt in art ed, you learn that kind of the playground, early education, you learn that the playground becomes the first beginning of being socialized as a kid. And the playground is such a really important place that your kids, when they come to the playground, they also are representations of the parents. And so the things that happen in the playground are basically things that they bring to the playground. So their own beliefs and the way that they engage with other people are really directly tied to the way that they are taught prior to entering the playground. And so to me, I feel like the playground is like this beginning place of the world for a kid to kind of understand the way that kids engage with each other, the way they take turns, the way they bully. Things that kids do are basically a mirror of their parents on their personal, in their home, and coming to this space of sharing, which is part of the negotiation of being in the playground, really says a lot about society. And so the playground for me was always important, but I was thinking about how to bring history into the playground. So the first playground I made was for Faina Art Festival, and that was great because I wanted to incorporate a photographic image into the playground structure. And so for me, it had...
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Why are there no photographic images in playgrounds already?
Yeah.
Interesting question. Right.
Yeah. So I was like, it started off being, about the history of the highway playground in Miami. It was one of the first ones to be built in Overtown. And it was a very controversial article in the paper about it. And I was able to acquire the image for the sculpture through the African American Historical Society in Miami, and I use it as kind of like a tarp, as a kind of a portal through the other side of the playground. So I mirrored the playground that was featured in the photograph. I kind of made it more contemporary, but I kind of used the same structural elements to create like a black and white version of the photograph and then a more colored version. Because when you look at the playground in an image, and it has to do with the way that people capture poverty, and I think the photographic image was trying to capture like black poverty in America and the way that they capture the image of these people playing under the highway. But for me, as a black person, I saw joy. Like I saw community. I saw things that, to me, extended color and extended fantasy and imagination. And there are many images that capture poverty in America of various racial and cultural groups. But the idea of representing black figures in this kind of particular place is too common. And for me, I wanted to kind of really expand on that as an artist and using all the liberties that you can as an artist to do that. So I've been thinking about it a lot. And so I'm always interested in incorporating a photographic element in the playground in some way as a reference to the motivation of the piece and the design of the piece.
That kind of opens up into my last question, because we typically think about artists as people who are doing something for themselves. They express their version of the world. Their studio is sacred space. In the studio, you can do and think anything you want, and it's really the exploration of your own mind. And you certainly have done that, but you also occupy, and I learned this somewhat more in depth last night speaking with you at dinner. I knew that you were starting this residency program in Baltimore. I knew that you had made playgrounds. Your partner, Michael, told me that you had made these coloring books. And then last night you talked about your role, a kind of behind the scenes role in this gallery in New York, the Rush Gallery, where you had shown all these, young Black artists in the late 90s and early 2000s. And this is a role where the artist is doing something for others. And particularly in the history of Black art in our country, it has been Black artists who have made Black art spaces, whether it's the Brockman Gallery in Los Angeles, or Noah Purifoy at the Watts Community Center, or the artists who formed the Studio Museum in Harlem, Noah Davis forming the Underground Museum. And you're totally in that tradition. And I wondered if you could just talk about the way in which that role of the artist as curator, artist as facilitator, artist as someone who gives back to their culture, and how that, how you occupy that role and how you see that yourself in that lineage, if you do see yourself in that lineage.
I was just always taught, like, whatever job you have, you're supposed to be the best at it and do the best you can do at it. And so when I started working at, Rush as an exhibition coordinator in the beginning in 97. I was really more of a facilitator, and I actually enjoyed that position. And I did a good job, I think, as the exhibition coordinator, then the curator, then the director. But the positions I was given, the titles, were always titles I never wanted. A lot of times the promotions I got were forced, because I realized
the problem with being good.
Well, I wanted to be I knew I was an artist.
Right.
And I knew that I was going to be making art, but I was doing my job as a curator because I know what artists want. Because I'm an artist, so I know what the expectation of having a show at a space should end, how it should end for you. You shouldn't, if you're showing an artist, and I've learned that if an artist doesn't have anywhere after leaving you, then you may not necessarily have done a good job in placing them somewhere. Because I think the time of working with artists, you should understand exactly what type of artists they are. And if they are, like, sometimes artists may think they're a particular type of artist, but they're making a totally different type of art. So I felt, as a director at a nonprofit, I was more in tune to telling artists, well, if you're making this, and this is not really something that you can really sell, then maybe you should look for grants or something. Or maybe you're not a gallery artist. And these were things that I also was thinking about for myself. So it wasn't like I was telling them something that I couldn't use. I was learning about myself and what kind of artist I wanted to be by working with these artists. So it was really, I always think that the positions I've held have always been like, what do you call it? Yes, but also something even more fun. Like, it's like when you have people drinking Coke and you bring all these people and you test out like a testing group.
Right.
I felt like being in the positions I was in, it was really more of a selfish reason as well, because I was learning, like, what artists want, what the expectations were. If you say that you need all these things done, like, then what time are you going to get to the gallery to install? Like, you say you have this whole list of installation things and you show up at 1, and then people come to the gallery at 6, you're still hanging up stuff, then I know I'm not going to do that. I know I'm going to get there early if I have a lot of stuff, or I'm going to organize some friends to come. So it was all things it was like a focus group. I felt like my experience in grad school and my experience running the gallery was just a focus group. And I was learning by observation and being in conversation with artists what type of artist I wanted to be. And I used that as is just the foundation of my career as an artist, because I never thought of success as having a gallery or having, teaching. I just thought that the main focus as an artist is to find a revenue stream that will allow you to keep making art. Even if it was like teaching or working at a store or doing whatever, the goal was to pay your rent, whatever you need to do to keep making work. I never thought about selling because I was working at a nonprofit, so selling was never a conversation that was being had most of the time. So for me, it's really more about exposure and just freedom to create. How do we manage that?
And I wonder if you could talk I mean, I guess my question's kind of corny in a way. What is the best thing for you about being an artist? Like, you didn't want it as a profession, right? You weren't out to make money off of it. You wanted to make enough money so that you could keep making it. Why? What is it about making it, making the work? What does it let you think, do, feel? How does it let you be in the world? Like, why
I just
do
feel
it?
good. Like, it just feels good that you have something floating around in your head, and you're able, and the success is being able to articulate that so other people can look at what's going on in your head. So that, to me, I think that's so amazing that, what people see in a career of an artist's life is something that was just floating around in their brain. And now sometimes it's a 20,000 square foot installation, it's a 10-foot painting. This 10-foot painting was in my brain, and this performance was in my brain. These things you're seeing, almost like the way that you see a landscape of trees around and buildings around, like someone envisioned that and someone executed that. And I
Right.
think about being an artist is more about that. But the practice of making art, I always thought that it was more about therapy and about freedom. So I always thought that not being a commercial artist, because most of the artists I met at the gallery, because I met artists who were mid-career, artists who had various experiences at a certain point, and they had, like, stories that were not necessarily happy stories about where they felt they were in the career as an artist. And I just realized, if I'm going to make art, I can't have those stories. And so I just had a reality check from hearing their story, that if I was going to choose to be an artist, I would expect less, because I had one really good one story. Because we were the only gallery that really represented, or not represented, but exhibited young black artists or artists who were kind of working outside the commercial world. I would I was there most of the time by myself. So I would get artists from various generations who would just come to the galleries and hang out with me. And sometimes they would bring wine. Sometimes they would come and talk about like issues they were having at teaching at colleges and how long they've been there. And some of these artists at the age I was 20, some of them were in their 50s. Later, they were artists that I thought were like legendary, but they were not necessarily happy with where they were. And one artist came to me one time, amazing artist, and she was talking and she started crying. She was like, she was a established artist to me, and she finished the conversation by saying, "Being an artist is a thankless profession," and I always remember that. So her impression on me actually made me have a certain perspective of being an artist. And that, to me, I feel like if I had not had that experience with her in the gallery that day, because being in the gallery, you also are very vulnerable when you are in the small gallery by yourself, because you get all types of personalities who come in, and you're sitting. I feel like I was a sitting duck most of the time. And so I could have someone come in and have a very happy day, or I can have someone come in and have a very uneasy day. So I felt like I was kind of like this person that people just kind of dumped on a little bit. And I got used to it. But then I said, it was time for me to go. I was like, it's too much. But I took all that information and all those experiences, and I just put it into my own practice. And I feel like if I had not had those experiences, I wouldn't be making the work that I make. Because when I look at blackness and black culture, I have multiple perspectives to look at it. So my perspectives is looking at, like Ed Clark or Frank Bowling or Howardina Pindell or, Emma Amos. And I had a really great story I want to say about Emma Amos. When I was at Pratt, we had our annual student exhibition, and we had it with the Black Student Union. And so Emma Amos came in, and at the time, I think it was like, 96, and she hated our show. She was like, oh, this work is terrible. What are you guys doing? She was like, so like, and I was like, who is, I didn't really know who she was. I was like, who is this person coming in here saying all this stuff, right? And then fast forward about 6 years ago, I happened to be in a group show with Emma, and that was when she was starting to experience early Alzheimer's. And it was a show that I was excited because I was actually in the show with this artist who came to my studio or came to my show when I was an undergrad. And I saw her standing in front of my piece, and she didn't know it was my piece. And I walked over to her and I said, what do you think about it? She was like, I just love this piece. She said, I can stand in front of it all day. Aww. And I said, oh, really? And she said, yes. She said, you know who made this piece? And I said, it was me. And she said, I just love it. Congratulations, this is my favorite piece. And I said, I was blown away, because she didn't know it was me, but I knew who she was. So I love that story.
That's so great. And for those of you who were around for the Gorilla Girls earlier in the month, you may have heard that the Gorilla Girls say that when one of the Gorilla Girls dies, they are outed, and Emma Amos was in fact a Gorilla Girl.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I can see it. I can see it.
Yeah, I could see it too. And for those of you who don't know the work, go home and Google her tonight, because some of my favorite paintings actually are by Emma Amos. She's a wonderful, wonderful artist. Derrick, I'm going to turn it over. I have like a million more questions for you, but I want to make sure that folks in the audience have an opportunity to ask Derrick any questions that they might have. There's a hand up in the back, and there's a microphone coming to you.
All right. Sure, Gail Falwell. First, like someone over there, I want to applaud you for doing joyous work.
Thank you.
Because I think sometimes,
Thank you.
you reap what you sow, right?
Yes.
And I think you're obviously an influencer, and if you might as well influence people the positive way. But that's the question I have. Did you ever feel like you got pushback from the art establishment for doing joyous work, as opposed to the standard you're supposed to be angsty, poor, and angry?
I mean, I think I do often. I think that sometimes we are making works that are not necessarily catering to what people think you should be making. It becomes a complicated conversation, because I think as a Black artist, sometimes people think that if you're not making work that is in line with an institutional critique of the way that is familiar, then you're not necessarily paying attention, or you're maybe ignoring or thinking about something that is not as significant to what other people are talking about. But for me, I always felt that the reason I make what I make is because my peers are making something else. And I believe in covering all bases. So you're making that, I don't have to make that. You're freeing me up. I can make something else. That's what I think about my work.
Oh, that's beautiful. There was a question over here, yes.
Hi, my name is Chantal. Hello. Yeah? Okay. I am in Rico Gatson's painting class right now, and in hearing your answers, I feel like you're just like culminating everything that we've experienced over the last week. But I'm curious about what you wish you were asked when you do these kinds of talks.
Come on up here.
No,
Not a jab, not a jab.
I feel like I'm hoping that I will take all the questions that are necessary to take in order for artists from the next generation not to have those conversations. And I feel like, what I find is that in certain generations of art makers and educators, the conversations you can extend into other areas that are already been documented. Like, this conversation is being documented. There are not going to be many more of these conversations, because they're going to no longer be necessary to have. They're going to be more about what's happening afterwards, just like the artists who were making work before me, and right, on and on and on. So I think that I personally feel that when I was in grad school in 2001 to 2003, the work I was making, I didn't realize that it was so important. Like I was just making what I felt I wanted to see in my studio because I didn't see it. And when I went to shows, I didn't see it. When it's certain things I felt like I wasn't seeing in the art world. And when I go to a museum now, I feel like I'm still not seeing it all the time because I think that, again, the black artist plays a certain role of kind of dealing with the things that other artists don't have to deal with. But I think that we should have the same privileges of expression and even bliss in things that are not necessarily about being so-called real or being raw. Like all black people are not raw. All black people are not edgy. Like we can be boring too. Like there's nothing wrong with being boring. There's nothing wrong with making boring art. Like there's a lot of artists who make boring art who are really successful. So I think that until we're allowed to make like all types of works, I think that's going to be the issue because we're not even allowing ourselves to do it within our own peer group. My challenge in grad school was not even other professors of other races. My challenge was more professors of my own cultural background who was saying to me, well, what about this? And I'm like, well, some other person is doing that. So let me do something else, And that was difficult.
You have your hand up with the glasses? Yeah. You want to just hand the microphone over?
Oh, yeah.
I've totally lost control of the room if I can't even call on the people who are putting their hands up. I'm just saying. Yes.
Quickly, I'm Jason. I was really interested seeing how you tend to have a lot of these objects that you'll also kind of have in your show. And I think you indicated a few hints as to your thought processes, why you might include them. You've kind of wore the curator hat, and performance art might come in there a little bit. But yeah, if you could maybe talk about how you'll have, like, you had these floaties that were in the show with the paintings of them. It's like if you want to talk about that a little bit.
For me, it's always about relational aesthetics. And I remember going to a lecture with a curator from a museum, and he was talking about the idea of witness objects. And witness objects are objects that are placed around works that may need more context. So they'll put things that will relate to what's in the painting in the museum, like plates, spoons, chairs, things to kind of give humans a perspective of what the work they're looking at is about from a perspective that's not an artist, but more on a human scale. So I like to put things sometimes, if necessary, in a show to really talk about the lightness of things. And so the floaties were something that I was enjoying in the studio, but I also was decided for the first time when I exhibited those works in a nonprofit called Project for Empty Space that was kind of nestled in the Newark Penn Station. I just thought that having those in the window or through because the gallery had a window you saw from walking to work. And so for me, it was really more about activating beyond the works on the wall and for people to see what the references, because the floaties and the painting, to me, were just depictions of objects that were in a painting. And they didn't really have the one-to-one. They also looked almost like fantastical. Like I just made these big, gigantic ducks that people were on. And I don't think that people really, some people, I didn't want to underestimate that some people knew what these things were, because a lot of people did not know what these floaty things were until maybe a few years ago, that I wanted to include them in the space as lounge furniture. So people hung out on them as a form of lounge furniture, kind of taken away from the traditional benches that are in museums or galleries, and I wanted people to kind of sit on those, and they did, and they ruined them. Yeah, they did. They ruined them. They ruined them.
All right, now you with the gold frames, please.
Can you hear me? My name is Michonne Sanders. I'm also in Rico's workshop. As a black artist, I know that my blackness enters the room before I do. But also as a queer artist, do you ever feel like responsible to represent queerness in your work, or is like blackness take paramount, or is it all kind of, mixed in together?
I think that you represent all those things regardless of your intention. only thing you can do is kind of push the conversation forward by being genuine with what you make, because you are speaking from a perspective of lived experience. So whatever you make, regardless of it's a bouquet of flowers or, anything, something abstract, a line, I don't think that you can separate identity from objects making, because what you make is informed by your experience. And so I believe if you're going to be making art for a long time, then you should make it as drawn out as possible to keep yourself interested as well as other people interested. I believe if you give them all, like a date, when you go on a date with someone, you tell them everything about you, you usually probably don't have a second date. So I think that it's better when you just kind of ration certain things that you think are important without trying to be so direct. For me, I feel like that because I want to learn things about myself too. So I think that a lot of things happen from learning through just genuine just reaction to things in my studio. And I look at it sometimes, and sometimes my friends will say to me, "You know what I love about your work? The male and female figures look so ambiguous." And I say to myself, "I didn't know that." Huh? Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I'm making what I'm making, but I like that they can fill those two spaces. I think that's really interesting because I'm not intentionally doing it, but I think that my work is also influenced by the people in my family, and I think the women in my family have very masculine features, and they're very dominant in personality. They're not very petite, and I think that they have a certain strongness to them, and I think just by imagination, I just always conjure them up when I'm making work.
Your aunties are going to get in that picture before it's all over. Let's take one more question right over there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Zell. I'm in Rico's class. I have two questions for you. One is there were some paintings, like with the man holding the baby, that there was some outlining going on, and a lot of your work does not have any outline. So part of my question is it the material that makes that happen, or are you making some other decision? The other question I have for you is I want to make work about disability, and do you have any recommendations?
Well, first I'll answer the first question. And the first question is usually when I make a new body of work, I'm always interested in doing something I didn't do with the other body of work. So I'll look at, when I'm making a body of work and I might have one series on one side of my studio and another series, I know that when I switch to the other side, I can't do what I did on this side. So I do that, and I also say things to myself like, I'll say, I don't like black outlines. And then I'll say to myself, why don't you like black outlines? Why don't you just make some black outlines and see how it looks? And then I'll just make black outlines and I'll say, actually, it doesn't look as bad as I thought. Let me, I talk to myself a lot in my studio. The reason why I started making collage is because I hated collage. In my mind, at first I said, ugh, I hate collage. Like I didn't like the work I was looking at, the people I saw, the way they were laying the collage on top of the paper. And so I said to myself, I'm gonna make collage because I had issues with what I was seeing and I wanted to do something that I thought, like I usually walk into the direction of things that I may be resistant to do. And I felt like that makes me constantly never comfortable in what I'm doing in my studio, because I think that I have to be mentally present all the time. Like when I leave, I'm mentally exhausted from thinking, and when I'm not like that, I'm not interested in the work. If I'm not like mentally engaged in what I'm doing the whole time, and I feel like I'm playing a game of Jenga. I always say to my friends, like when I'm in my studio, I feel like any little move, it could come collapsing down. So I feel so connected to my work, but that black outlines became something that I thought was really associated with the way I was making watercolors, and I wanted to bring that into the painting. And I know I didn't do it in my other works, but I knew that this work needed that. And that painting is really a special painting because my mom's in that painting. She's not the subject of the painting, but she was the godmother of the baby in the painting. And when I made the paintings for my family, I wasn't even looking at individual people in the painting. I was just looking at composition. So I was looking at all the images, looking at what would be a good painting, But now I know that I have to paint other people in my family that I have to look, that I'm just more mindful, you know, and dealing with the other question about representing, disabilities in painting or artists who deal with that. I don't really necessarily know any particular artists. I'm sure I have friends who are. They're not coming to mind, but I think that it's so much out there to look at and so much to to be influenced by. I think that you have to kind of be interested in what about that particular area that you want to focus on, because in every subject there's so many nuances to cover that the genuineness comes with your ability to capture things that you think are important takeaways for people who come in contact with this subject. So I think that's the thing that you as an artist have to personally be interested in, to know exactly what to devote your time to.
Derrick, I want to thank you so much. You exemplify everything.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. You really do. You exemplify everything I love about artists. You're generous, you're intelligent, you work against yourself, and you make beautiful objects, and you're funny. So thank you so much,
But thank
Derrick.
you. I want to say a special thanks to Sharon and John Hoffman for introducing me to Anderson Ranch several years ago. I came here for a show that Sharon and Rona Hoffman, one of the galleries I work with, as well thanking Jeannie and also Sarah Arison, who's here, for being very supportive, and you as well. Thank you. You're amazing. Michael's pointing up. Thank you, Michael. I feel like it's the Grammys or something. Shout out to Rico in the audience, my good friend. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.